Cool. Well, we'll get started. And I just want to thank you all so much for coming. We'll get started here today. Okay. Today we're really lucky to welcome John Nathan, one of the great translators and scholars of Japanese literature, here to the Elling-Ide Center. Professor Nathan is the Takashima Professor of Japanese Cultural Studies Emeritus at UC Santa Barbara. He's a prolific translator, having translated the works of Yukio Mishima, Kenzaburo Oe, and Natsume Soseki, and his translations of Oe are widely credited with helping him win the Nobel Prize. He's also an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker and has written screenplays for some of the top directors in Japan. Today, Professor Nathan is going to discuss the life and work of Yukio Mishima, arguably the most famous writer of the post-war period in Japan, whose life ended in public suicide after an attempted coup d'etat in 1970. Professor Nathan was not only Mishima's translator, but his personal acquaintance and the only biographer with whom Mishima's family was willing to cooperate after Mishima's death. His biography, written in 1974, remains one of the definitive biographies on Mishima's life. I just want to quickly say this talk is really meaningful to us here at the Elling-Ide Center. Elling-Ide himself had a deep interest in Mishima, not only as an author, but also as a person. In our rare books collection, we have many of Mishima's collected works, including a rare handwritten manuscript by Mishima from 1944. And Elling was so interested in Mishima that in 1969, the year before Mishima died, he actually went to Tokyo and through mutual acquaintances arranged a meeting with Yukio Mishima in which he conducted an interview with him. So I just want to say that having such an accomplished scholar and expert on Mishima's life and work here at the Elling-Ide Center, I'm sure Elling would be very excited here today. Just a brief comment about housekeeping. We are posting this lecture online, so if we can keep our phones silenced and away, just out of respect for those that are joining us remotely, that would be much appreciated. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor John Nathan.
And thank you to the Elling-Ide Center for your generosity and your invitation. I knew Elling briefly in about 1968 at Harvard. It turns out that he was 2 cohorts ahead of me in the Harvard Society of Fellows. We were one of a fairly small number of people who got into the society as East Asian scholars. And we didn't discuss Mishima at the time, although I had spent a lot of time with him just a few years previously to that. I'm not sure why. But in any event, I did know who he was, and he's clearly in my mind today. By the way, just so I don't disconcert you, I have a rebellious back and right leg, so I may be standing and sitting a little bit. If I stand up, it means it hurts less to sit, to stand, and vice versa. So maybe you don't mind. As long as I don't fall off the chair, I'm fine. So the question, who was Yukio Mishima? And it turns out, as we'll see, that that's not such a simple question to answer. What I can do is to begin with his extraordinary accomplishments. He was unbelievably prolific as a writer. Though he was only 45 when he died in 1970 by his own hand, he had written 35 novels, about half of them what he called serious, and another half which he called popular, and often he would work on both at the same time, remarkably. The popular books were all serialized and then published, serialized in magazines, principally read by women, which is an irony, as you'll see in a minute, and then became bestsellers and then became movies and so on. So he had this astonishing work ethic. In addition to these novels, he produced dozens of books of essays, 40 plays, all lavishly staged, and published 170 short stories, or about 25 volumes worth. And what he did for his entire adult life, he would go out on the town almost every night with various groups he was associated with, and in the midst of the revels and the drinks, everybody knew that 11:15 on the dot, he would stand and execute a very proper bow and excuse himself to go straight back to his study. Not quite straight back. He would go to the kitchen, make himself a bowl of chazuke, rice and green tea, have that, and then climb the stairs to this mirror-lined study where he would work from midnight onwardly until 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And I'll just add anecdotally that it was my good fortune while I was working on a translation of The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea to go and visit him at night. He would call me up and he would say, I've gotten a bit ahead on my writing, so I have a little time. Do you want to come over? And I would always jump on my motorcycle very excitedly and ride across the city to be with him. And his wife, Yoko, would wheel in a tray of brandy and liqueurs and things and leave us alone. And I would sit at his feet, basically, and listen to the man talk. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of Japanese classical literature. I'll get into that in a minute. And these evening tete-a-tetes were among certainly the most memorable times that I spent during that particular period of my very long engagement with Japan. So at the height of his creative power then, having written all these books, on the morning of November 25th, 1970, Mishima paid a visit to the commander of the Japan Self-Defense Force Ground Services on pretext of showing him a classical sword, which he had acquired. It was, of course, against the law for a private citizen to own one of these things at that time, but everybody sort of looked away, and the general in charge of this army was himself an aficionado of Japanese military weapons. And he was accompanied by 5 cadets from his Shield Society. This was a group of young men in his thrall whom he had enlisted in this little private army designed to shield the emperor from any harm which might befall him. At that point, he had already swerved, as we'll see in a minute, into the ultranationalism, which led him to choose the martyrdom that he did choose. So just before noon, at a given signal, the cadets seized the general, bound him to a chair, and then ordered him to assemble the troops present at the place below. Mishima tied on a terrorist scarf, 10,000 lives for the emperor, went outside on the balcony and delivered a speech appealing to these soldiers to rise up with him like real men and samurai to take back a Japan which had lost its soul, he claimed, not only its army, but its soul to the surrender and the subsequent constitution post-1945. He said, join me, and we'll return this place to the emperor. He had planned to speak for about 20 minutes, but the soldiers were very unimpressed and angry, and they were booing and jeering, get down from there, you moron! And so he gave up after just 8 minutes, retired back into the room where the general was bound, and unzipped his uniform jacket, opened his shirt, and proceeded to disembowel himself with a short Japanese sword while the general pleaded with him to stop. Having done that at a grunted signal, his right-hand man, the cadet, beheaded him with a sword and then committed ritual disembowelment himself. And then the others, on Mishima's instructions, turned themselves in to be arrested. There proceeded a long, long trial which was trying these people for something called assisted homicide. It was the first time that this had ever occurred in Japanese jurisprudence, and eventually these guys were all acquitted. In any event, that's how he ended his life. When he died, the most Japanese death imaginable, I suppose we'd say, by harakiri, the country was horrified. To be sure, the Japanese right wing celebrated him as a sort of latter-day apotheosis of a Japanese warrior. The left was dismayed and silent. The conservative government felt disgraced in the eyes of the world. In March of that year, 1970, Japan had put on a giant world fair on which the government had lavished billions of dollars, and they invited 70 countries. This was Japan's coming out, having recovered from the devastation of World War II, as a real country to be reckoned with in the global economy. 6 months later, Yukio Mishima had turned the clock back 150 years to a time when it was honorable, and in fact de rigueur, that a samurai would open his belly to show his allegiance to his leader, in this case, the emperor. So this was a dreadful thing which the Japanese just didn't know what to do with. In the community of literary critics and scholars who wrote about Mishima, these final action created what they called the Mishima problem. And what they meant was the difficulty of considering Mishima's writing on its own merits. a difficulty created by this overwhelmingly grotesque ending, his coup de théâtre, if you like, that he had chosen at the end of his life. I personally have no trouble understanding that impasse because I was working on my biography in 1972, just at the time the critics were still stunned and silent. And it's true, seeing the whole man with his work without being pulled off balance by the centripetal tug of this gruesome end was very hard to do. Like many others, I had formulated a hypothesis designed to accommodate and explain his unimaginable final choice. I still believe that my thesis was basically accurate as far as it went. I still think that Mishima's suicide by harakiri was driven by an erotic fascination with death that he himself described as an idée fixe or an obsession that he would never get free of. And through this lens, I see that the ultranationalism that he professed, having been remarkably unpolitical for the first majority years of his life, at the end, was in effect a kind of way of creating a battlefield on which a gentleman or a samurai could die an honorable death. That is ultranationalism as a means to this end rather than as the result of it. So he created this battlefield and did what he did. That doesn't mean that that's the whole story by any means, but it seems to me that this death ultimately was more private than social, more erotic than patriotic. And I wrote a whole book basically saying that. The problem, of course, with projecting, as I did, an interpretation on a writer, tying him down and thereby sort of limiting him, is that it can unbalance your approach to what he wrote. You begin looking always for a substantiation of your own theory, which I think I was guilty of doing. And so focusing on his death and looking for evidence that his writing holds, which leads to this end, can amount to reducing the work to sort of a pathological phenomenon. It's all sort of fodder for a psychoanalytic analysis of Mishima's fatal neuroses. Nonetheless, so I'm not going to spend today combing through his work looking for evidence of this principally. I do want to share one sort of breathtaking example, though, which I can't resist doing. Excuse me. And that's a story he wrote and published when he was 12 years old. His first published story was called Sorrel Flowers, a memory from Akihiko's childhood. And in this story, which is pretty remarkable for the work of a 12-year-old, a 6-year-old boy encounters an escaped convict. The boy climbs a hill forbidden to him by his parents, a taboo hill. And in the dark woods, the moon rises, and suddenly a very frightening man steps out of the shadows. And the boy says, "Where are you going?" "I started on a journey, but I forgot something at home," the man replies. "You mean the gray house on the hill, the one they call the prison?" "That's right. My house is called the prison." The man was surprised. This is a 12-year-old writing. "The boys were in Autumn Lake. What frightful purity." "Yes," the man murmured, and as he spoke, the godlike boy rushed at him and buried his face in the arms outstretched to him and wept. A nightingale high on a tree wept too. "I had a pretty little boy just like you. Now he is a seagull flying above the sea, and he says I was murdered on the gray evening sea. My murderer sank to the dark bottom. Until he floats to the surface, I must remain suspended here on these white wings in the low clouds of the sky." So here you have the essential elements of this moment are, of course, a dark, forbidden woods, a beautiful boy, a vaguely homoerotic embrace with a murderer who happens to be a filicide, even more yummy in a sense, and an Oscar Wildean nightingale singing in a tree. This is at 12. So this is in essence a compound of death, eros, and beauty, which uncannily Mishima seemed to be in touch with at age 12 as an obsession that would compel and terrify him all his life. I should add that at the end of the story, a year later, the boy returns to the hill with his young friends. The convict who has served his time has just been released, and he gives them each a sorrel flower. It is a joyous moment. Then, suddenly, an army of women, angry moms, march up the hill and destroy the happiness of the moment. Touching a convict, how dirty, they shout. The children drop their sorrel flowers to the ground, and they glow there with the setting sun. So in much of what we would later read about Mishima, we can see him taking his revenge, I'll get back to this, against womankind. I mean, he had a tremendous aversion, and he made them pay often in what he wrote. So there's an abundance of additional evidence of this, but I don't intend today, as I said, to go through it. What I would like to do instead is to focus on what appears to be a unifying theme throughout his vast oeuvre. And I'm going to call that an antipathy to normality, an aversion to normality that produced a range of perverse themes and debauched characters. What is perversion, after all? In a moral sense, the word connotes a turning away, right, from what is right. And more generally, it can mean a turning away from the way things are normally done. So I'm going to propose today that in much of Mishima's writing, perversity functions as an antidote to normality. I'll begin with the 1960 story, 3 Million Yen. This is curious. Those of you who are interested in translation, Edward Seidensticker, who was a cranky, very skilled translator whom I knew well and often fought with, did all kinds of weird things. He calls this 3 million yen. And the Japanese title, as you can see, is Hyakumaen Senbei, which means 1 million yen rice crackers. These are crackers that have engraved on them a kind of Hyakumaen sign, and they stand for good luck. I don't know where Ed Seidensticker pulled 3 million yen from. It doesn't appear. Anyway, that's just a side note. So in this story, a young married couple enjoys a carefree, indeed idyllic, afternoon in proletarian Tokyo near Asakusa. So Kenzo and his young wife, Kyoko, are a paragon of wholesome living, loving and attentive, frugal, with an eye to having a child in the future, and so on. We watch them go through this day, and it says, isn't that lovely? And at 5 o'clock, they keep an appointment with a cranky old lady. And we infer from what she says that their assignment that night, and indeed the way they make their living, is by giving live sex shows in the living rooms of wealthy clients. It's kind of shocking, it comes out of nowhere. So there, the reader infers this, and we see that Mishima has cunningly assembled this very wholesome picture of two young people whom you would judge to be in love and all the rest of the things I've mentioned, only then to deface it with a slash of his pen by turning it on its head and turning it into a shocking assault on normalcy. Let me go now to Mishima's 1963 novel, the book I happen to translate, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, because this is even a more explicit condemnation of the everyday and the normal. Early on, the sailor, Ryuji Tsukazaki, reveals an obsession that is common to many of Mishima's protagonists. He dreams of, quote, glory knifing toward him like a shark from some great distance in the darkly heaping sea, of, quote, a glittering special ordered destiny no ordinary man would be permitted. This is a fantasy that many of Mishima's heroes, in fact, embrace. And in this iteration of the fantasy, there is a familiar link between this special destiny and Eros and death. So the sailor meets the beautiful widow Fusako while on shore leave and kisses her. And Mishima writes, for Ryuji the kiss was death, the very death in love he had always dreamed of. In the dark rapture of the kiss was something directly linked to death. He was perfectly aware he would leave her in a day, yet he was ready to die happily for her sake. Death roused inside him. But the sailor forsakes his dream of special destiny In love with the widow, he proposes to her and promises never to sail again into the unknown. In effect, he turns his back on the sea and becomes a landlubber, returning to a normal life, a mediocre life in place of a hero's life, a life of sentimentality. For these sins, he is convicted and sentenced to a terrible death. His judges are a gang of precocious 13-year-old boys, who, including the widow's son, who observe the tailor with dismay and keep a tally of his sins in their eyes that will justify a death sentence. But with each new death, Mishima writes, speaking through the eyes of his avenging angels, another of the fulsome odors of shore routine adhered to the sailor. The odor of home, the odor of neighbors, the odor of peace, odors of fish frying and pleasantries and furniture that never bunched. All the putrid odors landsmen reek of. In the concluding scene, the boys lure the sailor to a deserted beach, resolved to return him to his heroic death by destroying him. And we have seen what they can do because we've watched them vivisect a cat as practice for this. And I was told by a writer called Kobo Abe, often considered the Kafka of Japan, a dear friend of mine when I was a young man, that Mishima had called him up and said, you know what, I want you, he was a doctor. Abe had a medical degree. He never practiced medicine, of course, he became a novelist, but he said, I need to do something with a cat, and I'd like you to come and watch with me. And Abe said that Mishima, they had destroyed a cat. Actually, and then Mishima, because you see, he's a realist. And so we have this number of pages, sort of gruesome description of what happens. So we know it's awaiting the sailors. And the boys have brought along a rope and a scalpel. And the last thing that happens, they offer him a cup of tea. It's drugged tea. And he realized that the tea tastes bitter. And the final line, which is a line that Mishima must have had in hand before he began writing this, was, glory, as anyone knows, is bitter stuff. So that's the end of this sort of nasty indictment of choosing normalcy instead of dangerous adventure. Let me digress for a minute here and talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the title, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. This is, in Japanese, an untranslatable homonym. It's pronounced gogo no eiko. You see that up there. So when a Japanese speaker hears gogo no eiko, gogo no means afternoons or in the afternoon, eiko, he thinks of the common meaning of that word, eiko, which is glory. So he thinks this means afternoon's glory, written this way. But when he sees it on the page, he sees that it is the word eiko, same pronunciation, that means towing or tugging out, an afternoon's tug. So here are those two characters, eiko on the one hand, eiko on the other. You know, my son Toby is here. I was trying to do something clever with my slides, and I couldn't figure out how to make this animate properly. And Toby always points out quite correctly that I'm a little bit compromised where technical things are concerned. So this is the best I can do. This is what everybody thinks on the left, and the right is the actual word that Mishima chose. So what do you do about translating this? The best that I could come up with was drag out, or perhaps even more cleverly, glory is a drag. But the editor-in-chief at Knopf objected. He said, this title might inspire a reviewer to ask, why does the story drag out so? So I had the opportunity and the privilege of going to Mishima, which is something that modern-day translators don't usually have. And I said, Mishima-sensei, I don't know what to do with this. He said, well, let's do like Proust. Let's be Proustian here. Let's do a long title. I said, great. He proceeded to reel off half a dozen very interesting titles, which I wrote down in English as he came up with them. And one of the neatest ones was The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. So I said, great, and I went back to Knopf, and I said, listen, this is a Mishima Yukio title, so I don't want to hear anything more about what is the reviewer going to say, and so on. And that's the title that we published the book under. I thought that was worth sharing. So, as I mentioned, most nights of his life, Mishima worked at the desk from midnight until dawn, and it was his habit to warm up for several hours with a popular novel, an entertainment. And many of these things were bestsellers. They had titles like Capital of Love, Love Stampede, The SS Happiness Sets Sail, and That Complicated Fella. And these were things that people just absolutely adored. And one of them, they account for fully half of his novelistic output, and they reflect a vulgarity and a cheapness, a meretriciousness, if you like, similar to glittering tinsel on a tree, that were legitimately a part of Mishima's sensibility, no less than his amazing refinement. He liked to say, paradoxically, that he was a sensitive man with garish tastes. So these love stories he churned out can be seen as the literary equivalent of his glittering cufflinks, his tie pins, the kitschy bust of Apollo alongside the sundial in his miniature front garden, and so on. Now, only 2 or 3 of these things have been translated. It's unfortunate because many more deserve translation. They were tossed off, to be sure, some in just a couple of weeks, but they weren't trash. The plots take clever twists, and Mishima was incapable of bad prose. It's sort of like a violin virtuoso who stops off on the way back from a recital at a hoedown, if you like. That's kind of the way he performs. So the comic novel, Yukio Mishima's letter-writing classroom or master class, untranslated, is a little example I wanted to share with you. This has not been translated yet. It probably this is features 4 very quirky characters who share a consuming interest in writing letters. This was set in the 50s, before mobile phones and the internet and so on. And Mishima begins with an introduction of all 5 of these characters. Let me see if I can have this here, sorry. The eldest is Mamako. Mamako is heavy, a stately widow and formerly a beauty. She runs a successful English conversation school out of her home and has upper-class pretensions and a busy love life. Her friend, Tobio, is a famous clothing designer, thin as a rail with a skinny mustache, a cynic, certain he is more refined in all matters than anyone else. He and Mamako are good friends and confidants, but not lovers. Married to a former seamstress, but a philanderer, Tobio has 5 cats and 500 neckties. So the 80 letters exchanged by these characters are utterly cynical and perverse. This is Mishima at his snarky best, reminiscent in a way of Truman Capote, a writer whom he greatly admired. He defaces, in this case, or transforms a better, what might have been a straightforward love story into an elaborate tangle of lying and betrayal, where both good faith is mocked and romance becomes a travesty. So I'll just give you a tiny taste of this. Tobio is enamored of the ingenue, 20-year-old Mitsuko, and proposes that Mamako should sabotage her romance with the young Takeru, an actor. Here's Mitsuko and here's Takeru, an actor, by slandering him. Mamako has a crush on Takeru, responds. Listen for the perversity in each of these exchanges. Quote, "In any event, I'm very fond of that young man, Takeru, and also of Mitsuko. I prefer them infinitely to a middle-aged designer like you, with all your money and your cats. Liking them as much as I do makes me want to torment them, so I'll participate in your evil little scheme. Even if my love for Takeru is unrequited, I want the object of my love to suffer a loss as great as my own. I want him to become just as incapable as I am of trusting ever again noble intentions in another person. That will allow my ardor to cool. No one can love a person exactly like herself. Wouldn't you agree?" So Tobio promises to do what he can to sabotage the romance by slandering the ingenue Mitsuko to the young man's parents. But he ends up doing the opposite. He impresses them with how wonderful she is. Mamako writes, quote, "I've heard all about your despicable betrayal. I'm so surprised by your humanism and Buddha nature. I'm joking. I know there's not a speck of humanism in you, and certainly you are no living Buddha. You trampled on a request I had to overcome my shame to ask of you. For such a person to put on the face of a humanist as you bring two young people together is such hypocrisy, it makes me nauseous. Tobio is unfazed. Quote, no matter how you curse me, I won't get angry, but neither will I apologize. Truth is, it was you who moved me to betrayal. In a manner of speaking, you reaped what you sowed. Indifferent to shame or reputation, you revealed your true self to others. How unpleasant, how difficult to hear. After all the time we spent together, carefully avoiding anything close to the truth. What can you possibly have meant by confessing your true love? Reading your note, I realized something. I was jealous. It seems I'm in love with you. So in the end, as in all comedy, everyone is reunited. The young lovers marry, and however improbably, so do Momoko and Tobio. So in this case, the world evoked in these letters is as cynical and perverse as anything Mishima wrote. Well, not quite. This takes me into his last masterwork, The Sea of Fertility. It turns out that he was secretly months and months ahead of where they thought he was on Volume 4, because he had two rather close advisors at the publisher Shinchosha, and he knew, and they were worried about him because he was behaving very strangely. We had this army, he was marching them around Tokyo. He went on bivouac. A question I've never been able to answer is how a private citizen managed to get the Japanese self-defense force to allow him with his boilets to come, his boichiks, to come on bivouac in the army. Can you imagine somebody here saying that to the Marines, can I come and do boot camp with you? I mean, Mishima loved that, and they let him do it. I'm not sure why. In any event, the last volume, as I said, he had secretly written in advance. So they weren't worried yet because they knew that he wouldn't do anything really outlandish before completing this, what he called his masterwork. And in fact, he dated the last page on the day he drove off to do his coup d'etat, followed by his suicide. No one knows exactly what the timing was, but it's pretty clear that he was way ahead of where they thought he was when he finished. So this tetralogy is about reincarnation in the Buddhist sense. The hero of the first volume, Spring Snow, which I think has been one of the best books Mishima ever wrote. I recommend it to you. Haru no Yuki, Spring Snow, is the son of an aristocrat dedicated to the cult of elegance, rather like the tale of Genji. I mean, everything has to be beautiful, and there should be no purpose in life. He believes in being, in living obediently to his feelings like a flag in the wind. The hero of the second volume, Runaway Horses, is an ultra-nationalist who assassinates a robber baron and then commits harakiri. His reincarnation in Volume 3, The Temple of Dawn, is a Thai princess who dies of a cobra bite. And her reincarnation in the final volume, The Decay of the Angel, is a heartless 16-year-old orphan whose goal is described by Mishima as, quote, abstract malice, as revenge against tedious happiness. So here we see once again this assault on the normal, we might call it. Each of these characters is revealed as a reincarnation by a triangle trio of moles that appears on their sides in each case. And observing this process over the course of 60 years is this fellow Shigekuni Honda, a man of probity who becomes a wealthy judge. And Honda's role throughout is an attempt to deploy Western rationality and reason against the mystery of transmigration. So this spans a period from the turn of the century to the 1970s. It is a remarkable work. And it's sort of a compendium of vintage Mishima motifs. Almost without exception, the main characters are shockingly artificial, scarcely human in the normal sense. This is particularly true, maybe, of the hero of the first volume, Kiyoaki Matsugai. This is a guy who has been entranced from childhood by someone named, sorry about this, let me see if I can, why doesn't this, yeah, here he is, Kiyoaki Matsugai, and he has been entranced from childhood with Satoko, the beautiful daughter of an aristocratic family like his own, but with direct connections to the imperial court. The attraction is mutual. There's a gorgeous scene in a snowbound carriage that includes an intoxicating first kiss. Subsequently, Satoko writes Kiyoaki an indiscreet love letter that concludes, quote, "To feel myself dissolve in your beauty and freeze to death in the snow. No death could be sweeter." The reading about her letter, here is what Kiyoaki thinks. If the two of them had really fallen in love that snowy morning, how could they bear to let a day pass without meeting, if only for a moment or two? What could be more natural? Yet Kiyoaki was not inclined to follow his impulses in such a way. Oddly enough, living only for one's emotions, like a flag obedient to the breeze, demands a way of life that makes one balk at the normal course of events. For this implies being altogether subservient to nature. The life of the emotions detests all constraints, whatever their origin, and thus, ironically enough, is apt eventually to fetter its own instinctive sense of freedom. In other words, if there is a natural response to human feelings, Kiyoaki chooses something else, something antithetical to normal. He is a model of perversity. When he learns that the son of the crown prince has chosen Satoko for marriage and that an imperial sanction has been issued which ensures that she is now off limits to any other man, his experience of that news is, quote, so irrational, so passionate that it was almost unearthly. And the passage that follows is as quintessentially Mishima-like as any I've ever read. Quote, "If one were to ask what caused this delight, the only possible answer would be that it sprang from impossibility, a sheer impossibility. Just as the string of a koto cut by a sharp blade yields with an abrupt, poignant note, so the tie that bound him to Satoko had been cut by the shining blade of the imperial sanction. In the midst of his wavering inconsistency, this was something he had dreamed of and hoped for in secret since he had begun to grow out of boyhood." Pretty perverse, I think you'll agree. Kiyoaki is by no means the only character in the Sea of Fertility who must labor to simulate normalcy. The 16-year-old protagonist of the final novel, The Decay of the Angel, Toru Yasunaga, stands at an even greater distance from what we would consider normal. In one of Mishima's most cynical scenes, Kiyoaki's friend from Volume 1, Shigekuni Honda, an old man now at 76, who has adopted Toru, tutors him in appearing normal. He prepares Toru to function as a weapon of revenge against the women who will succumb to his beauty, which reminds us, of course, of Dickens' Miss Havisham training Estella to bring suffering upon the men who court her. It's a similar kind of thing. And it's a terrible scene. But Honda says to him, "And you must make polite conversation as you eat that puts your table companion at ease," he begins. "Now then, I'll say something to you, and you must answer. We are acting on a play, all right? You are studying hard, I see, and you have your 3 tutors all speechless with admiration, but it seems a little odd you should have no real friends. I don't feel any great need for them." That's no answer at all. If you give that sort of answer, people will think you queer. Give me a proper answer. Toru was silent. "This is the sort of answer you should give as pleasantly as it can be. I'm studying so hard that I really don't have time at the moment for friends, but I'm sure I'll have some as soon as I start prep school." And it goes on this way. Eventually, Toru develops what he calls in his diary, quote, "a delicate machine for feeling how it would be if I were to feel like a human being." And this is chilling because if you know Mishima and sort of look back on his whole life, it's hard to avoid the sense that he was himself trying hard to feel like a human being. That's a funny thing to say, but I'll talk a bit more about it in a minute. You'll see what I mean. So, in this final volume of the tetralogy, which he was writing, even as he was planning this unthinkably grotesque ending, not one character remains unsullied by debauchery and decadence, or both. By this time, even Honda, the paragon of probity, the judge, has been made to succumb to Mishima's perverse, gleeful cynicism. He has become a voyeur, installing peepholes in his villa and spying on lovers under cover of night in Hibiya Park. So he brings him down. The Decay of the Angel may be Mishima's most irredeemably cynical work. And it goes on that way. I think we can fairly say that all this reduces to an attack on normality. In every case, most dramatically where Honda is concerned, the perverse, the turning away, overpowers the normal. Now, in this world of decadence and betrayal, in which Mishima appears to delight, how do we account for a novel like his best-selling 1954 book, The Sound of Waves? I don't know if any of you have read this. Shiosai. Mishima had recently returned from an extensive tour in Europe. Greece had enthralled him. He was ill with Greek fever. Here he is on shipboard, bound for San Francisco. He wrote, "Sun, sun, perfect sun. I have the feeling none of the unknown lands I see can exceed the wonder of this. Today I did not watch the sunset. Having spent the day gazing love-struck at the sun, I had no heart to see her in her ancient, feeble makeup." The Sound of the Waves reads like a monument to Mishima's professed emancipation from an obsession with death and eros and beauty. It's a story of first love between an 18-year-old fisherman and a young diving girl living on a small island on the Gulf of Ise, and it unfolds in the brilliant sunlight with scarcely a cloud to darken it. The wholesome vision that animates this novel is exceedingly rare in Mishima's work. In contrast to the lurid scenes of moral and physical depravity that he's so good at and spends so much energy creating, this book, a romance, is colored by a pervasive chasteness. In the most famous scene in the novel, the fisher boy and the young girl confront each other across a bonfire, naked. And the girl challenges the boy, "Jump across the fire to me. Come on, if you'll jump across the fire to me." The boy obliges and takes the girl in his arms, but they shyly desist and vow to wait until they can be married. The 18-year-old hero of the story, Shinji, is an utterly anomalous Mishima hero. Antithetically to the sailor, he has, quote, no impossible dream of adventure across the seas. The sea to him was like land to a farmer. Furthermore, even less likely and still more unfamiliar, death holds no allure for him. At one point, when he's been prevented from the girl's dad from seeing her, he thinks in despair for just a moment of love suicide, double suicide, which was a common phenomenon in Japan, but only for a moment. Quote, "Double suicide then? Even on this island there had been lovers who took that solution, but the boy's good sense repudiated the thought, and he told himself that those others had been selfish persons who thought only of themselves. Never once had he thought of such a thing as dying." Can this be a Mishima's hero? Unlikely. The book ends happily, excuse me, with a celebration of marriage. And the fisher boy reflects. He was thinking that in spite of all they've been through here, they were in the end free within the moral code to which they had been born. Never once having been estranged from the providence of the gods. That in short, it was this little island that had protected their happiness and brought their love to fulfillment. Safe to say, Mishima's happiest ending. Readers loved this. Mishima's best-selling novel to date, it broke all post-war records with a sale of 106,000. That's a very small figure, but you have to consider when this was. Japan is just returning from utter impoverishment. 106,000 paper hardback copies. Continues to sell 100,000 copies in paperback and has been turned into a feature film 5 times. I was among those readers who was fascinated by the book, and that led to one of my most embarrassing moments with Mishima. I was sitting there at night in one of these great times that I so enjoyed, and when I began to effuse about the novel's lyrical beauty, the unblemished purity of the characters, I noticed Mishima watching me like this with a cigarette dangling from his lips, a funny look on his face, and I just kept on shoving my foot further and further down my throat. And when I finally finished, he laughed his sort of donkey bray of a laugh, and he said, "That was a lie. I wrote it like this." And then he pantomimed, holding a piece of manuscript paper with his eyes closed and writing down the page like this. And it was pretty devastating. I remember, and at the time I was too nonplussed to say or think of anything. I put my entire foot in my mouth. Was he lying as he claimed? Perhaps it's not as simple as that. Later, he wrote in an essay, "About this time, I had a desire to turn myself into my own opposite, even in real life. Naturally, I cannot be certain whether I actually created my own opposite or merely an aspect of myself which until then had been ignored." The point is that Mishima is nothing if not a man of contradictions. One of the reasons he so prized the paradoxes of Oscar Wilde. He lived a life that was flamboyantly and unapologetically Western in style and manners. He dressed in flashy Italian suits and smoked Cuban cigars. When he built his house in 1959, he told his architect that he wanted, quote, to sit in a Rococo chair in jeans and then low a shirt. The result was a melange of Greek statuary and French period furniture that it was like a movie set, and made many Japanese who received invitations to his cocktail parties on Tiffany stationery, I have a number of those, horribly uncomfortable. He used to enjoy that. He used to say to me, "John, watch this. See, the Japanese don't know how to stand in a room with some hors d'oeuvres on a plate on one hand and their cigarette and their drink and chat with strangers. I mean, it drives them wild." You see that? As a Westerner, you can appreciate that. And he really took pleasure, kind of a perverse pleasure in this. I'll share 2 memories of you which seem relevant. One night, he took me to dinner at a fancy French restaurant called La Belle Époque on the top floor of the Okura Hotel, and he explained that this was the only place in town where you could get authentic crêpes Suzette flambée, and that I, as a Westerner, would know how to appreciate this, unlike the Japanese who didn't. So at the end of our meal, he orders, with a flourish, crêpes Suzette flambée, and the waiter goes white and says, "Excuse me, we're actually out of Grand Marnier." And Mishima went wild. He said, "I'm sitting here with the only Westerner in the restaurant who will appreciate this. You go and get some Grand Marnier." So the waiter backs up, and 5 minutes later, drenched in sweat, he comes back with a bottle of, I don't know where he got it, of Grand Marnier, and he doused the Suzette and lit it, and this look of appreciation came over me. He said, "Genuine thing, right? Genuine article." And I said, "Absolutely." Then he was pleased. So I'm talking about, here's this contradictory thing, the hatred of normalcy and the overwhelming desire to incorporate. Here's another story which I will share with you. On another occasion, I was sitting with him late one night, and he goes out of the room, and he comes back dressed in jeans and a thick black belt. And he says to me, "John, I've been working on these jeans with sandpaper for quite some time now. I'm trying to get the look of the jeans that Marlon Brando wore in The Wild One. How did I do?" And I said, "You're a spitting image for Brando." And, then this look of satisfaction suffused his face. That's what he really wanted. So clearly he was infatuated with European and American styles. At the same time, he had a prodigious command of classical Japanese literature and could write fluently and beautifully in the language of the Heian court or the medieval period. In addition to his 18 3-act plays, he also wrote 10 modern no plays and 9 full-length kabuki plays in the language of that 18th century edition, which are still performed today in the National Theatre. In an article Mishima wrote for New Year's Day, 1967, Faith in Japan, he accounted for the apparent contradiction between his Western-style life and his emerging ultranationalism. He asserted that he has adopted a Western lifestyle rather than, quote, an ugly syncretic Japanism because it allowed him, quote, stylistic integrity, and concluded very plausibly, quote, my true life as a writer is the pure Japan of the Japanese language I use every night in my study. And yet, and where Mishima is concerned, there is always going to be an and yet. In the letter he left for his father, he asked to be buried in his Shield Society uniform and wrote, I die not as a literary man, but as a samurai warrior. So it's like, what are we to do in the presence of these stark contradictions? So which was it? Black or white, day or night? The answer seems to be neither, or more properly, both. As in the Yeats poem, antinomies of day and night seem to live together in this man, and tying him down to one interpretation or another amounts to simplifying and thereby diminishing. Shortly after the death he chose had dismayed all who knew him, a lifelong friend and literary critic tried to sum up what he had become known as the Mishima problem. Excuse me. What was Yukio Mishima to us, and what will he be in the future? I still do not know. In my mind, I cannot comfortably link the man I knew as a friend, the writer whose work I hungrily devoured every time he published something new, and the mind-boggling act of self-destruction. I find it impossible to fit them logically together to construct a total image of Mishima. As I said, I perfectly understand the mind-boggling act of self-destruction, but it seems clear to me that attempting to fit these things logically together is a mistake that simply just exacerbates the confusion. A complex man contains all of these things that don't fit together logically. Finally, let me return very briefly to the Sea of Fertility. In the penultimate scene of the last novel, Toru, blind from having taken drugs in a suicide attempt, sits alone with a young madwoman, pregnant with his child, who is at once his caregiver and wife. A dismal scene, but it's not the end. In the final scene, Honda, now 80 years old, travels to Kyoto for an audience with Kiyoaki's lover from Volume 1, Satoko, who is now the abbess of a temple. She's taken refuge in this temple and agrees to meet him. Honda explains that Kiyoaki Matsugai was his dearest friend and adds that her predecessor at the nunnery wouldn't allow him to see her when he came here last. The former Satoko's response is bewildering. I have never heard the name Kiyoaku Matsugai. Don't you suppose that there never was such a person? Honda is dumbfounded. If there were no Kiyoaki, he protests, then there maybe is no Isao, the terrorist. Maybe there was no Ying Chan. And who knows? Perhaps there has been no I. Then Mishima uses a very strange, very ambiguous Japanese word, kokoro gokoro, meaning in all hearts. And she says, that too is as it is in each heart. So an usher, a novice, then ushers Honda into the south garden. He's dazed, totally bewildered by this, and he reflects, quote, the garden was empty. He had come, he thought, to a place that had no memories, nothing. The final line of this 4-volume work, quote, bathed in the blinding summer light, the garden was hushed. Readers didn't know what to make of this after 1,000 pages of a tetralogy. It was like, is this a joke on them? Was it a shaggy dog story? Referring to his masterwork in progress, Mishima had written, I am a realist who attempts to depict with complete reality a romantic psychology which cannot be found in reality. So he leaves us with paradox. I could end here, but I cannot resist sharing with you one more thought that occurred to me as I considered this enigmatic and somewhat disappointing ending. In 1967, Life magazine ran a feature on Mishima titled Japan's Dynamo of Letters. And the story focused on his unflagging energy and his overwhelming zest for life. The parties, the movies he acted in, the broadly diverse circle of friends he maintained, Western and Japanese, and so on. He was a dynamo, the journalist wrote, greedily consuming every experience life had to offer. And yet, here it comes again, in a letter he left behind for his mother, he wrote that he had never managed to feel alive. Not long before he wrote a curious short story, not long before his death, he wrote a very strange short story called From the Wilderness. Narrated in the first person by Mishima, a novelist whose name is Mishima, the story described an actual incident when a disturbed fan had broken into Mishima's house early one morning, terrorizing his wife and parents, and demanded an audience with the author. The police arrive and he is dragged from the house screaming at Mishima, "Please tell the truth." The story is related on its surface, almost like a newspaper article. Then, abruptly at the end, it swerves into something deeply interior in the narrator, Mishima himself. Where did my young man come from? Naturally, the police didn't tell me his address, but gradually, I began to have the feeling I knew the answer. He came from inside me, from the world of my ideas. I feel certain that my young man is my shadow and my echo, but I am not the simple monochrome he imagined. A novelist's being is expansive. If there are airports, there are also bus terminals. There are business districts and shopping malls, tree-lined residential areas, suburban trains, and housing projects. I have memorized every side street and back alley in the farthest corner of my being. But there is a large area I have continued to disregard that remains uncharted. I've lived my life ignoring it, careful to avert my eyes. I'm speaking of the vast wilderness surrounding the metropolis of my being. Unmistakably, it's a part of me, but it is an unexplored, barren area that doesn't appear on my map. It is a region of desolation as far as the eye can see. No verdant trees or flowering plants, only a biting wind that dusts the top of jutting rocks with sand and then blows it away. Though I know the location of this wilderness, I've managed so far to stay away. But I know that I've been there once and that someday I will have to make the journey again. Clearly, my young man came from that wilderness. I'm not sure what he had in mind when he demanded the truth from me, but I have complied. I have told the truth. Now, some Japanese critics reading this weren't sure. They considered this unpredictable ending to the story gimmicky. But I am left with the strong feeling that Mishima was telling the truth. So what I take away from this is that the truth of Mishima's world, part of the truth anyway, was a vast, barren loneliness. And I wonder if that isn't just another version of the garden, empty and hushed, into which a flabbergasted Honda is ushered at the end of the Sea of Fertility. I wonder if, in effect, Mishima wasn't telling us the truth at the end of the tetralogy, that the emptiness stripped of memory is in fact the world he inhabited, trying to feel alive and failing. But this is becoming so ambiguous that I fear that if I don't stop here, I too may disappear like all the other characters. And so I'll stop. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions if you have any. Yes. You want to do this, Nick?
Do we have some time for
Totally. And my friend Matthew is going to be my amplifier because I don't hear too well, so I'm going to make sure that I get your question. He may repeat for you. Nick, why don't you pick people for us?
So we'll start right here, and if you can use the microphone, that would actually help us.
Oh, okay.
It's on.
Can you hear me?
No.
Yeah, just on. It's just that's on for online. It's good.
It's good now?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Who was Mishima, after all?
I mean, you've elaborately explained
Well, I tried to explain.
his psychology from his works, but just the outline of his identity socially, and whether that can illuminate our understanding and enable us to deal with the obvious
I hear what you're saying.
paradoxes and contradictions. Who was he?
I'm interested to use the word identity because one of the things historically that has been true of Mishima is that Mishima booms in Japan seem to have corresponded or coincided with times in which the nation at large was particularly insecure about what it meant to be a Japanese. And ironically, since at the end of his life in particular, he took such a strong, apparently certain stance about who he was, young Japanese readers tended to grab at this and use it to supplant or to reinforce their own uncertainty about what it meant to be Japanese. And the Japanese can be said to have been plagued by a national identity crisis intermittently during the post-war years. It comes and it goes, you know. And Mishima popularity seems to wax and wane with the wave of that identity crisis. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what occurs to me. It doesn't answer your question. I'm not sure I...
Thank you for this. Your discussion focuses on his literary output, and I'm struck by how little you refer to your personal interactions with him. You know, knowing virtually nothing of the man, I wonder, did you find him to be manipulative or a poseur in his conduct with you or in his other social relationships?
Great question. Thank you for asking it. When Mishima died, almost everyone had felt that they were his best friend and felt completely betrayed. They had no idea what was going on. I mean, he was great at living a totally compartmentalized life. He was a great masquerader. So in my case, you know, what he saw in me was a young American guy who had the gift of translation, which was very important to him because he was avid for the Nobel Prize, and who had actually beat him in arm wrestling, which mattered to him. I mean, now I can't even lift my arm, not to mention beating anybody. In those days, he was a strong young guy. So he related to me in a very specific way, and I saw no more than he wanted me to, nor did anyone else. So he was a very hidden, brilliantly guileful, as I say, masquerader, who could come along, similarly to his heroes, had been coached by himself in how to make you feel one way or the other. So he was with me. He was very glad-handing, very pleasant. We liked to go dancing. He would call me up and say, "There's a new restaurant just opened in town. Let's see what kind of a bill we can run up." Akio Morita, the chairman of Sony, brought a French restaurant to Tokyo, and Mishima was right on it. You know, he said, "Let's go to this restaurant. It might be really expensive. I'd like to see we order everything. Well, how much is that going to be?" And I, of course, was delighted since my budget didn't permit. So does that answer your question? I don't know.
Well, up to a point, did you see any suggestion that he would take this dramatic step?
None. Absolutely none. And people who spent much more time with him than I did saw absolutely none. That's what this fellow Okuno is saying. I mean, it just came out of the blue. So his body lifters, his theater people, his photography guys, his literary people, his diplomats, because he was friendly with all the Americans. He wanted to get his name in the paper a lot. Nobody saw what he didn't want them to see. I certainly didn't.
Thank you for the lecture. Two questions. One is there any evidence of him taking any drugs or any hallucination, or is it in the 70s? So that's one thing, if there's any that type of things going on. And another thing is there any because talking about his this paradox and stuff, and is there any parallel between him and Hemingway, for example? Because Hemingway died by suicide. So in research treatment to Hemingway, is there like people try to find a clue in Hemingway's work to predict his death, the way he died, versus Mishima? Yeah, like they try to find the clues and stuff.
Well, that's interesting. First of all, as far as the drugs are concerned, I had no sense that Mishima was taking drugs, and I would be surprised if he was, but he was a surprising guy, so I don't really know the answer. Hemingway is obviously a very different sort of person, on some level much more open and closer to less twisted in a way, I think, than Mishima was. So, why he got depressed, and Norman Mailer has written a whole book about why he thinks. I don't really know how to answer that exactly. They're two very different kinds of people, although both of them, of course, were committed to a sort of butch, masculine, adventurous persona, so they were similar in that way. I don't really know enough about Hemingway to answer your question properly, I'm afraid. I mean, I don't see in The Sun Also Rises and whatever else I've read about Hemingway the kind of evidence that one finds in Mishima quite abundantly, pointing in the direction of this possible end. They're very different, really. And of course, suicide is very different in Japan than it is anywhere else. So.
Did he ever talk about, or did Yoko, his wife, ever talk about their marriage and his homosexuality, and which was hidden, and how he worked all of that out?
Okay. When I went to Tokyo to write this biography, I called Yoko-san, the widow, whom I had seen in the past. She had taken over his business role and seemed to be settled into being somewhat like him, but very defended, very strong. And I said to her, she would let me come to the house and pick up books and things. She called people and opened doors for me. And when I finally said to her, I'm looking forward to hearing Yoko's story, she said, there is no Yoko's story. That was the end of that. I mean, she made it clear that she wasn't about to say one single word to me about her relationship with Mishima, and so I can only speculate. And what I speculated was that they had an agreement that he would lead his life and she would lead hers. I can't believe he attempted to conceal from her his erotic life. How could he possibly do that? So I expect that she had bought into that for some reason or another. Does that answer your question? No. We can discuss it later.
Could you explain, because Mishima was very, he liked Western things, but he also wanted to restore the emperor or the empire, and he was very nationalistic with his Japanese identity. And then you told the anecdote about him wanting to go to all these restaurants that were Western, like the French restaurant. He was very into it. He wanted the flambe. Could you explain how he, why did he become this person who was very nationalistic, but also wanted to reject the West, but also encourage Western ideas and culture? He had the Greek statues. Could you explain that? Yeah.
Can I explain these apparent contradictions, are you asking, in his behavior?
Yeah. If you could give any more insight, I guess, if you can't, if you think it's unexplainable.
Not really, man. I mean, he was a contradictory guy.
Okay.
Is what I can think. I mean, I don't know how to answer your question very specifically. He did embrace two sort of radically different kinds of cultures and aesthetics and tastes, and he was conversant in both. It would seem he was very defensive about and then mean about the Western stuff. He wasn't nice to his countrymen, particularly, which is an irony, since he became an ultranationalist and said that the Japanese had a very special role in the world. It's very hard to get inside the head of a man like that and explain how he managed to embody both aspects of this kind of culture. I'm not sure if that's the question.
Do you think his he didn't appreciate his fellow countrymen because they were they become Americanized, they become...
Yeah, he considered them narrow and myopic about things. He considered they were ignorant of their own pasts, which angered him, and he considered they were very awkward in their attempts to appear conversant with Western manners and ways of being. So he had a kind of a cynical, supercilious attitude about people around him, I think, although he didn't show that a lot, but it was there.
Okay. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you, sir. I was wondering if you could speak for a moment about the Peers School. I know Mishima attended as a young man, and I've been very fascinated about what effect it would have had on his life, because only other aristocrats were able to come to the school.
Oh, you're asking about the Peers School?
Peers School, sir.
Yeah, you're asking why he was at the Peers School?
Or what effect do you think it could have had in his life, or if he mentioned it to you
Well,
ever?
I think it had a huge effect on him. I mean, he was the Peers School was a school which, properly speaking, was only open to members of the royal family or otherwise titled Japanese former aristocracy, which Mishima was not. And somehow the family managed to get him in there, and of course he received, at the end of the fourth year, the best student in the school received a silver watch from the emperor's hands. That, I think, was a formative moment in his life when the emperor actually gives him this thing, and he realized, of course, he was also by that time already being championed by a whole school of Japanese writers, the Japan Romantic School, as the greatest thing to have occurred in post-war Japan. What a blessing this was to have a writer so brilliant. So I think it was very important for him, yeah.
You mentioned you arm wrestled with Mishima. I'm curious, did he ever speak to you about the importance of bodybuilding to him, a regimen, and any other aspects of maintaining his health or physique?
I did go weightlifting with him twice. And then he wrote me a scolding letter in which he said, I hear that you haven't showed up at the gym. You know, if you want to do something with your lats, you better go 3 times a week or else it isn't going to work. So, I mean, he was a very unhealthy, skimpy young man. And he worked very hard to build up, but only his body from the waist up, so that his leg, he was known as asparagus boy when he was growing up. And he left his legs undeveloped. So he never would appear usually in short pants, although he did walk around in a fundoshi, which is very exposing, of course. But so he was muscled, but it was all artificial, built by him. I never heard him talk about his health.
Is to him, so he was, making up for his spindly physique when he was younger. Was it also related to his idea of the warrior, that he would be very strong?
Oh, to be sure. I mean, he had a very, he wanted to be a warrior, and he wanted to be very strong, and he was strong, Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. We didn't talk about sleep deprivation, but if he went out we left him he went out every single night and then went up. When did he sleep?
It's a good question. He slept from about, I would say, 7 or 8 until late in the morning anyway. And I did something a little bit manipulative. He would invite me, and I would drive my motorcycle knowing that at 2 o'clock in the morning, he wouldn't let me drive. He would send me home in a car, which meant that I could go and pick my motorcycle up the next day. So I was always wait until 11 or so in hopes that he had wakened and was out on the balcony which I often succeeded in doing. And then he would say, and I'd get to have another hour or so of conversation with him. So, he would work most of the night, and he was almost always up having his morning coffee by 11 or maybe noon. So I hear what you're saying. Maybe he was horribly sleep deprived.
And then the other thing I'm wondering, if you don't want to be normal and you hate everything that's normal, do you ensure your legacy besides in your work by choosing a death like that instead of dementia or fading away or cancer?
You know, he was terrified of aging beyond the point where he could be beautiful and die a beautiful death, to be sure. And as a matter of fact, he wrote a famous story called The Boy Who Was a Poet. His dream was to go out like a skyrocket when he was 21, which is why, and he had this fantasy about a heroic death in World War II, while he was still at the height of at the full flowering of his youth. And that didn't happen, and that was, I think, schematically, to him, a very important, very disappointing, a frightening reality. So you're absolutely right. I mean, he was very afraid of aging and of not being able to die, you know, heroically. So that may have been in that complicated mix that drove him to his fatal course. Yes?
With such a high intellect, I'm curious about his parents and what type of upbringing how they raised him, or...
Well, his father was a very unimaginative bureaucrat who would burn his manuscripts every time he went out of the house, because in those days being a writer was not considered an honorable profession in Japan. And so he would hide his stuff and his father would find it. And I actually interviewed his mother, who was very reluctant to speak to me, and she insisted on meeting me at a kimono goods store, and we'd had a sort of a whispered conversation. And then I went to their house. They lived in an annex. And she came out, and I sat there. No, the father came out, and the mother refused. She was in the back room. And so I would ask the father, well, what was it like raising Yukio? And the voice would come from the back, how would you know? You never did anything about it. And I would have to pretend that that wasn't happening. I would just ignore that and just talk to the father. Would you consider yourself, you know, were there any incidents? There certainly were. You burned his manuscripts and you were a sadist. I mean, she was saying these very nasty things about him from another room. So that's what I know about his parents. I don't think it was, you know, his grandmother took him away from his mother when he was when he was like 4 months old, and kept him in her sick room until he was 12. His mother was the daughter-in-law and had no power whatsoever to resist this or oppose it. And she lived on the second floor, and the grandmother insisted that young Yukio might fall down the stairs, and she wasn't having any of it. She was the matriarch who controlled the family. So he had to spent the first 10 years of his life, you know, giving her massages and taking care of her bed sores and all kinds of things. She would sometimes take him, however, to the Kabuki theater. She was very cultured. But by the time he was 12, he had already incubated a fairly horrific fantasy broth that included, you know, death and all that sort of stuff that he wrote about. So I don't think he had a happy childhood. It was very childhood by any means. He had a sister whom he loved who died rather young, and he had a brother who became a fairly successful diplomat. That's mostly what I know about the parents.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I just wondered if you touched on it a bit regarding the titles of Mishima's works and the challenges of putting an English title on them. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the challenges and joys of translating his literature into English.
Titles can be very tricky. Sometimes they're handled well, sometimes they aren't. In Mishima's case, Mishima was in general more amenable to translation, I would say, than people like Kenzaburo Oe. The reason being that, Oe considered himself a liminal character in Japanese society, like Camus. And as a result, he wrote a kind of Japanese that was an attack on the traditional language. He would write, and then late at night he'd get drunk and deform his sentences. So when the translator gets a hold of that, how do you do that without breaking the linguistic back of the English sentences? It's very hard. Mishima considered himself the direct heir to Japanese traditional beauty. And he wrote that at age 16, a famous, very lyrical passage about how someone had to inherit this. So his Japanese was created in full accordance with the natural beauty and genius of the language. There was nothing tricky or awkward or deformed. So that means ultimately that when you try to render this in English, somehow it turns out to be easier. He was sort of a mosaicist who would choose these beautifully colored stones and insert them in comely sentences. And if you can do this, easier said than done, but find the right stones in English and assemble them in a kind of mosaic, your chances are that his voice will emerge. With regard to titles in particular, a lot of Mishima's titles seem to be pretty easy. Kamen no Kokuhaku, Confessions of a Mask, sort of a no-brainer. The Goku no Eiko, the sailor thing, was very difficult. But usually, Haru no Yuki, Spring Snow, he doesn't offer normally challenges to the translator in terms of his titles so much. I'm trying to think. There was a short story included in the collection we just did that Penguin UK just published, which was titled, the title was the name of a Chinese prince who was so beautiful that he had to wear a grotesque mask. You know who that was?
The Prince of Lamling. So
yes.
Ranyo. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
What's the Japanese for that?
So in Ranyo in Japanese, Lanling Wang in Chinese.
Okay, so that was the title of the story, Ranyo. And so I suggested to the translator that if you try to just do that, it doesn't come across. So instead he called it the something flute, because the story is all about this magical flute in the story. So you sometimes make these shifts in order to make a title work.
Thank you very much. Given how spectacular was the failure of his attempted coup, and yet how definitive the plan was for his suicide, it would seem on the surface that that was the ultimate goal that he had. Now, to refute that hypothesis, I would ask, were there any unfinished manuscripts that he left behind that would indicate some view to the future?
First of all, I 100% agree with you. I mean, it seems clear that the whole insurrection was a kind of a device leading to and enabling the death. So that I think you're absolutely right on. As regards other manuscripts, that I don't really know. I'm not. What sort of manuscripts did you have in mind?
Well, were there any unfinished pieces of work that he had left behind that would indicate that he was thinking of finishing them at some point in the future?
No, I don't. I'm not sure, but I don't think so. I don't know definitively the answer to that. I mean, he did do some political writing at the end, but it was sort of very late in his career,
You have time for just a few more.
Have you seen the unpublished manuscripts, original manuscripts?
I have not.
Mishima,
I'd like to.
in this library?
No, I have not. I want to, though.
Yeah.
I would like to.
We hope you'll look at them and
Yeah, I would like to do that.
appraise them.
There's a question back.
Thank you. So with your theme of your thesis of perversity in mind, I'm wondering if you can locate like a central theodicy in his writing, and if you would go as far as to say he eroticized suffering in any way.
Say again, Matthew.
The theme of
Theodicy?
Theodicy,
like suffering, the...
Theodicy.
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 Homer's Odyssey.
Yeah, you can comment on it.
Like what he...
Oh, theodicy. No, I'm not sure. What is theodicy?
Oh, it's just like an account of his reasoning behind suffering. Like why, do you think that he eroticized suffering in any way, or if his characters were mainly hedonistic?
Does he eroticize suffering in any way?
Is this on?
Oh, I think he did. If you're asking, did he eroticize suffering? Is that your question? Yes. Yes, indeed. I mean, there was something masochistic. Saint Sebastian and what he suffered. He has photographs of himself posing as Saint Sebastian with arrows stuck into his side. So pain was something that he relished in some manner, to be sure. Yes, I would say yes.
So one last question, and maybe someone who we haven't heard from.
I just would like to ask you, he was a writer. What is his literary legacy for the society, for us, and for the Japanese? Can you summarize this?
His literary legacy. Well, a number of his novels are, beautifully formed, and they comment on human behavior. I'm not sure if that's a legacy. I mean, he left his many Japanese critics considered him the greatest Japanese stylist of the 20th century, so that one of his legacies would be this beautiful Japanese that he left in such immense volume. In terms of a message, I'm not sure really that Mishima's message had a very broad application outside a world that would have to be considered pretty abnormal, which is why ultimately I think he has a kind of limited importance in that sense as a great writer of the world. If we're talking about Tolstoy, for example, I mean, there you have a whole textbook about human behaviors which we can relate to. It's not so easy to relate to Mishima's characters because many of them dangle from the strings of a kind of concept which he had, which is not to be found in nature, really. So it's very hard to think of that as a legacy so much. It's beautifully written, but the people themselves are not necessarily real enough to permit us to learn from them the way we learn from a Tolstoy's character. That's what I would say. People would disagree with me, of course.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Well, let me just say in answer to your question about legacy. Sure.
One time, so he did get the Nobel.
No, he did not.
Right.